Good morning, everybody. My name's Michael Woods, and it's my pleasure again to host the briefing for Pharmaxis, this time on PXS 6302. I'd like to welcome back many of you who probably participated in the briefing on Tuesday. And for those that didn't participate in that briefing, we are going to post the recording of the briefing on the Pharmaxis website IR section over the coming couple of days. So you'll be able to catch up on that if you choose to do so. In that session, we heard some very detailed overview of the oncological applications of PXS 5505 in cancers that have proved really difficult to treat with existing chemo and immunotherapeutics and have generally very poor prognosis. That's primarily due to the extracellular matrix fibrosis, either contributing significantly to cancer symptoms or potentially providing some kind of protection against those therapeutics. And in each case, the inhibition of LOX enzymes is postulated to allow for a reduction in symptoms and enhance performance of existing therapies, is either combined or in myelofibrosis as a standalone therapy. Today, we're going to be exploring another of Pharmaxis' drug candidates, PXS 6302, as a topical agent to treat fibrosis we're all more familiar with, which is scarring, both cosmetic as well as significant functional impairments for patients. Firstly, we'll hear from Gary, who will give us a recap on why Pharmaxis is looking into scarring. And before moving on to Dr. Mark Fear and Professor Fiona Wood to tell us a bit about their research into this. So I'll pass over to Gary, and then after Gary, I'll introduce Dr. Mark Fear and Professor Fiona Wood in more detail.
Thanks, Michael. I'll just share my screen and show you some slides. So just for those apologies to those of you who joined us on Tuesday, just for a couple of minutes, just to recap on Pharmaxis and the sort of the stage the company's at the moment. So we are a clinical stage drug development company. We have had a long-term research program, a multi-year program, which has looked into a particular kind of chemistry, amine oxidase chemistry. And from that have come a number of targets that have looked at diseases where inflammation and more latterly fibrosis have played a key role. And we think through the collaborations we've had with scientific and academic groups worldwide, we've developed a world-leading position in this particular kind of lysyl oxidase inhibition. The drugs we produce are all small molecules. They're irreversible inhibitors of the enzymes, the lysyl oxidases, and they're all first-in-class and best-in-class drugs there as well. So there's nobody else in this field that's ahead of us in lysyl oxidase inhibition. So we are forging a path. And that's why we've ended up with a lot of collaborations like the one you'll hear of this morning, because we have drugs which can be used to test hypotheses about this enzyme in human disease. And from that research program have come 4 studies, 2 of them already in progress and another 2 planned to start recruitment later this year. And that really puts us as a company at a very exciting stage for investors to evaluate, understand some of the science here, and look at the short-term data that's going to come from these clinical studies that will drive value for investors. So I mentioned before that we were leaders in lysyl oxidase chemistry and biology, and I'll leave the chart on the left-hand side to Mark to introduce you to, because Mark will talk far more eloquently than me about the role of lysyl oxidase enzymes in fibrosis and scarring and how that pertains particularly to scarring of the skin. We have 2 drugs. The first one, 5505, was talked about on Tuesday, and I encourage you, as Michael said, to look at the recording of that if you weren't able to join us on Tuesday. We had 3 different centers from the US and Australia talking about the application of this drug 5505 in treating fibrosis that's associated with cancers, myelofibrosis, liver cancer, and pancreatic cancer. That's currently in a study in myelofibrosis. The other drug which we're going to be talking about this morning, 6302, is a drug which comes from Pharmaxis' own research. So it comes out of our labs that are based just outside Sydney. This is a topical drug, so it's going to be applied to the skin as opposed to be taken as a tablet. And it's a very recent patent. So this is something which has come out of our development pipeline very recently. It's patented only in 2019. So we've got a lot of patent life ahead of it. And I think, as you're going to hear, a really exciting potential to help patients with a variety of different fibrosis of the skin and scarring in particular. So that leads us really to those 4 trials before I hand over to Mark and Fiona to talk more about the last 2 studies. The studies we talked about on Tuesday were in 5505 in myelofibrosis and hepatocellular carcinoma, a form of liver cancer. The addressable markets for both of those cancers are large. The existing chemotherapy in myelofibrosis, albeit it doesn't actually treat the disease itself, it treats the symptoms that come from the disease, already selling $1 billion a year. And we're now in a phase 2 study. We're recruiting 24 patients, and that we should have data on that by the end of this year. So that's a really exciting prospect for us as a company, that we might make a significant difference to those patients and then be able to go on to develop that further to become a therapeutic. The liver cancer one is being done by a group in Rochester, New York. They've done a lot of preclinical work in liver cancer and shown that if you add an antifibrotic, particularly R5505, on top of their existing chemotherapy, then the cancer is much more responsive to the chemotherapy. So that by breaking down the fibrosis, you allow the drug in, and then that helps the chemotherapy work better. And in the animal models of liver cancer, we see big improvements in survival in those patients. So that's starting to recruit next quarter. It will be 18 patients. We'll have data by the end of next year. So the 2 trials that we'll talk a little bit about this morning and the science behind them are in scarring. And I'll leave that to Mark and Fiona to talk about. But I just wanted to address the issues of having a company that's going into cancer and fibrosis and associated with a number of different cancers. Why did you end up in scarring? And I guess the answer to that is that the science led us there. And in particular, Fiona and Mark came to us and said, this is a really interesting enzyme in this particular area. And, what about collaborating on it? So we've had a multi-year collaboration with Fiona's group over in Perth, one that we're very proud of, and we're excited about the work that they've done that you'll hear about. And when I started to look into this, scarring is, Fiona will talk, I'm sure, about the unmet medical need here and the impact of scarring on patients. But also when I started to look at what other treatments were available and the other companies that were operating in this space, there's really very, very little that addresses scarring. There's quite a lot of development work in terms of wound healing, but when it comes to scarring, there's not very much new, and it's crying out for a pharmacological approach to treating scars. And then when you look at the numbers, there are something like 100 million patients per year who have operations that end up in scars. So clearly the number of people out there who are looking for treatments is enormous. And I think we're starting at the early stages of this, but we're really hoping to see some clinical proof of efficacy, some signs of efficacy that come out of these next studies that give us the impetus and the encouragement to go on in this area. So with that, I'll hand back to Michael.
Thanks, Gary. And I think I'd just like to also highlight that it's not just the number of people getting surgeries each year, but this has the potential, as you would have seen in that third trial, for existing scars that are greater than 1 year old still to be treated, which I think opens up an even larger market.